Thank you. And to be clear, we have 3 creators here and me, so I don't want to misrepresent my role in the panel here. We'll start with you, Gray. You have an installation downstairs using Gen AI tools, and I was hoping you could talk to the audience as a jumping off point about what it is you're doing downstairs, how you're utilizing the tools, and what it is about these advancements in technology that have you so excited as a creator.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been playing with generative AI for like a few years now, and it was always a state of having to type in something and then wait like multiple minutes, or like that now just 30 seconds, and now just 10 seconds, and finally got a chance to play with a new open source model, Stream Diffusion, that's what I'm showing downstairs, that generates at like 12 frames a second, which is definitely enough for it to like behave like video, and it feels so different as like an interactive medium to actually like have dynamic interaction with it. And I'm taking a webcam and spewing that information into the network, and it behaves so differently when you get this like real-time dynamic feedback with, and I feel like that's a really important threshold of interactivity that like we need for artistic mediums. Like we're used to that with clay and with paint, and we haven't really had that with a lot of like the generative AI because it's taken so long to generate. But we're at this point now, we're at this threshold where once it can get real time, you can have like this dynamic like interaction with it, and I feel like that's what the level of when it actually starts to feel like a true medium. Nice. Now, Anna, in your work at Usurpator Mag and elsewhere, you focus on highlighting advancements in these types of creative applications of AI. Can you just tell us, based on your work over the last year plus, what are some observations that you've taken away, either points of excitement, points of disappointment, or something in between?
Yeah, I would say that I focus a little bit more on like artists, not so much their practice, but like their inspiration and what they're doing, instead of like the actual practical applications of like AI that they might be employing. In terms of what's exciting me, it's probably too easy to say, like, I mean, the past year or two has been such a huge boom in terms of AI. You could probably say anything. Like, if you want to give a boring answer, you'd probably say, like, ChatGPT. And I think the thing that's probably most surprising is, like, every time one of these new tools comes out, there's, like, so much hope, and everyone's kind of like, this is going to change everything forever. And then after, like, a month or two, the panic kind of dies down a little bit, and you're like, well, maybe not. Maybe it'll change a little bit for a little while. And that's like probably the biggest takeaway that I found is like, probably don't freak out about anything just yet.
Well, speaking of a propensity to freak out, Rudy, in addition to your design work at 131, you also, as a researcher, track online behavior and the societal impacts of being online. I'd be curious, from your research, from your observations, what insights you've gleaned in terms of the artist's relationship to advancements in technology, and what is the artist's role in a society where technology is becoming more and more prevalent?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you.
There is, I think that the term artist is quite broad, right? And there's different categories, and for each of these categories, the function changes with these new technologies. I like to split it in 3. You have first your hobbyists, which are folks like maybe yourselves or parents who are just engaging maybe painting or ceramics, and they're just kind of doing it on the side. In the middle, you have commercial artists, who are artists who may have a fine art practice, but who are actually engaged also with clients. They're producing illustrations, video work, music for essentially clients who will pay for that work. And you have really the fine art, which I would consider a big part of like Hollywood, but also gallery work in that category. And so for hobbyists, what these tools allow is you have an idea, and you're trying as much as possible with the clay, whether that clay be code or writing or music, to get to the end point. And then the creative tool, whether it's generative AI or something that helps you write, helps you get to that point slightly faster. But as you know, if you're a hobbyist, sometimes you don't want to go faster. That's like your break, right? And so you take your time in engaging and getting to that end point and producing that output. For the fine artist, what I've seen a lot of is the artist will utilize the technology as a way to speak about the technology itself. So it's kind of flipped or subverted. I'm thinking about the work of, yourself, or even of Fabiola downstairs, and even my own work, which I think utilizes artificial intelligence, but also is sort of reflective of the technology and its potential impacts. The group that's very impacted is the commercial artists, because the client has this thing called cost, and they always want to drive it down. And so if you need to have an illustration for a magazine, and your magazine's differentiator is not the illustrations, then you might think, okay, I can just produce more illustrations with generative AI, and you might actually cut in your illustration budget. And that's really where it hurts, because that commercial industry is where a lot of artists make money, because it's kind of hard to sell a ton of painting, but you can actually do illustration at a sort of regular frequency, and that keeps you afloat and keeps your fine art practice afloat. So I see that as being a potential impact.
All right, now sticking with you, but switching gears a bit. On one side, we have creators. On the other side, obviously, we have consumers and fans, and in your past writings, you've expounded upon the internet's ability to create what you describe as culture's true virtuous loop, which is when fans actually have the ability to participate in the creation itself, either through commentary or through their own creation of derivative works. Can you talk a bit about what that loop is, why it's so important to the creative ecosystem, and what thoughts, if any, you have about how the proliferation of generative AI tools may impact that loop ultimately?
Yeah, so what Reggie's referring to is my essay called Fan Fiction After AI, which focuses on fan communities, which some of you may be a part of, whether you like Supernatural or Harry Potter or Taylor Swift, I don't know, and then you might be a part of one of these communities that not only listens to the music or reads the book, but also engages in fan fiction. So you're writing a story where Taylor Swift, instead of dating Travis Kelce, is dating Travis Scott, and you're writing a whole story, and then people on Wattpad or on Tumblr are sort of opining on that story. And there's this rich community. We're talking like millions of folks who are engaged in these different niches and producing content, images, videos, stories about these individuals or about these franchises. And that virtuous loop is the ability for the artist to put something out there and for that community of fans to take it and make it their own. Because maybe the reality that we are in now is not the one you want to see, and you want to see Taylor Swift actually dating a woman, right? And you make a Gaylor fan fiction, right? And that power to me is very, very interesting, because it's really the ability for fans to insert themselves and their narratives into these stories, which sometimes exclude them. And that is that virtuous cycle where the creator might actually sort of acknowledge parts of it in their songs, or we saw Nicki Minaj recently with Gag City, which was this extremely interesting participatory album release where fans actually using Gen AI were creating their own vision of Gag City for her album Pink Friday 2. The problem with these new technologies is when the technology is not only facilitating, but seeks to replace the act of creation. And that's when you break that virtuous loop, and the fan is no longer needed if it's just a machine creating the fan fiction, right? And so I think artists need to be careful when they provide their fans these tools that they're not replacing, but really augmenting and facilitating. And that's one of the risks that I've been seeing.
Now, Anna, speaking of risks and the need for caution, you mentioned previously that a lot of your work focuses on inspiration, right? And when it comes to Gen AI, there's been a lot of excitement about what is possible in terms of increased efficiency and the way to increase productivity while bringing down costs, which is a bit ironic in the creative field in particular, right? Because the so-called inefficiency and those tension points when you're working through a difficult idea or working to overcome some type of creative block are often the moments when that inspiration arises. And so I'm curious if you have thoughts about what might be lost as we inject tools that are designed to create efficiency and to facilitate a more easy transition through those difficult points. What impact do you think that may have on creative processes and the search for inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would still consider myself a humanist in the way that I think when people are consuming art, they are searching for some kind of connection with like human resonance, with inspiration. And I think that an affordance of AI is that it can definitely speed up these creative processes, but it can't yet replace them entirely. And I mean, what's that thing? It was like, it was some app or some game where you had to choose, you had to pick if the artwork was either AI generated or was like a historical painting. And it was definitely difficult to figure out. But I still think that it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really change the point that is what we're like subconsciously or even consciously looking for. That's why art exists. It's to create that connection. And I don't think that AI can yet synthesize inspiration in a really resonant way. Again, it's great for speeding that up, but I don't really think that it serves to replace that like instinctive starting point that you need when you're going to create something, whether it's art, whether it's a song, whether it's literally anything. It starts from like that fundamental or necessary piece of like very human-centered inspiration.
And I honestly see the relationship of the audience to the artist still remaining very intact, where like you want to go out and see a live performer perform in real time and like express their own self through what they create. And if their favorite tool is something that's generatively created by them, it's still like their own like artistic aesthetics and sensibility that's producing that. It's harder to imagine everyone coming into a room and it's just like a fully automated system generating the beats and like everyone's down for that. Maybe there's context for that, but I totally agree that there's still like something very central to like the artist as like the primary crux of like that agency and that like aspiration, even if the tool itself is novel.
And I think you can see that now in how media is being consumed. For sure, you have fans and audiences streaming or watching music videos, but what do you hear the most about right now? You hear about the Eras Tour. The Eras Tour is like the most selling tour in the history of the world, potentially. And fans will rush, they will travel to go and see the artist play in person. And fans still travel to Paris to see the paintings in person. And there is this true connection that people still feel the need to experience and live through. That, of course, potentially the music is made faster through these new technologies, but still there is the desire to experience it in a group, in a community, whether it's at a concert, in a gallery space, or in a museum.
Right, there's been a lot of talk throughout the day about humanity's relationship to AI, either the need to have humans driving the process of development, the need to take into account human behavior when thinking about how it's going to be used. There's arguably nothing more human than the ability to create and to take elements of our experience and project them into a work of art. And so I think to your point, there's still going to be this need to maintain these spaces and these vessels through which those connection points, the things that make art resonant in the first place, are preserved. Now, Gray, I know a lot of your work in the VR space is focused on trying to make digital products more reflective of our physical experience and how we move through the world. Can you talk a bit about how advancements in AI technology are assisting you in kind of perfecting that pursuit?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of my interaction design experience, like a lot of that has been spatial and revolving around like VR, hand interaction, and that is a challenging space to operate in if you don't really know how to code or if you're kind of self-taught, and that's something where like these generative tools like ChatGPT have been like absolutely like central to my own practice and like gaining facility with like a novel language. And I completely see the same thing happening for a generative system if someone may not have access to like a whole cadre of like screen printing technology, or they can't necessarily afford Photoshop, but they can have access to, I'll shift back to what you were saying about spatial. It's sad to me how much of the generative sphere is based on this, like, oh, you just put in a text prompt and you click generate and you're done, and that's like really as much interaction as you've had. And I feel like that I can feel the dissatisfaction there with like a lot of artists who are like, wait, what did you even do? You just like put in a sentence and you got something out, and that's like, you're done there. But it does feel like this larger, or it's open to a larger realm of exploration where like you may generate one thing and that then triggers your association to vary it in this other direction and then fuse it with something else and then like recombine it again, and you may end up having gone down like 40 or 50 different subsequent generations in this large tree, and it feels like this sort of spatial exploration. And I hope that people can learn that they have that kind of aesthetic eye just from interacting with these tools if they wouldn't necessarily have access to the caliber of like artistic creation that they would otherwise come to. And so I think in the end, I hope we end up with more total artists on the planet who have a chance to discover like, oh, I can create and like attune my eye aesthetically towards things, and it's still likely going to end up with these like categories of artists who, if they're hired for art, they will, the person who's hiring them will maybe be the artist doing it instead of the person that they're hiring. And I don't necessarily see a robust solution to that. But I do see that like the act of making the art is still happening. It's just like what level removed, and it only gets sadder if it's just like a purely commercial kind of like, we just need filler background and there's no real thought behind it.
Now let's stick on that point for a moment, and it's actually a perfect transition to the next question. Now there's historically shifts and transitions in technology lead to net job growth rather than job loss. And there's been a lot of concern expressed about what the proliferation of Gen AI will mean, particularly for the creative industry. I think it's one thing to pontificate as an economist or as a historian where you can kind of approach the problem from a macro level, but I'm curious as people who are involved in the day-to-day in the creative industry, how you think about how this technology may impact your industry overall, what you think may be lost and what you think may be gained, and I'll open that up to the group.
We are, 20, 30 years into our sort of new technological revolution era. And I dare you to go to a gallery in Soho and tell me what kind of art is being sold. It's still paintings, right? And so there is a certain stickiness to some art forms. And when I think about disruption, I also think about the almost economic supply and demand nature of how if there is a glut of a specific thing, people have a tendency to revert towards something that they feel is more scarce. In the age of the MP3 and of digital media, we saw a return to vinyl, cassettes, and CDs by the specifically like the super fans who wanted to own the physical item, right? And similarly, if you do have an abundance of digital media, some folks, specifically the ones who are quite specific about building that relationship with the artist, will go back to the physical object or the painting or the sculpture. And to this day, what people want on their walls in terms of the art market is still paintings. And I don't see that being really disrupted by screens or by any sort of digital media. There are, what's going to happen is potentially more people will buy art in the same way that like now people who may not have liked paintings, I've seen people now they have screens and they show digital artworks, but that's just not the same market. I think it's more opening new markets than replacing the previous one.
I mean, I think it's kind of, I don't know, the thing that your question made me think of is that I feel like it's kind of sad how the advent of AI is mostly affecting like kind of lowbrow jobs, stuff like not necessarily web design, but like stock photography, like these creative jobs that aren't necessarily like centered around having a thesis and like a super involved creative process or like something like that where you're like showing in galleries at the end. Like I think that people deserve to have creative jobs even if they aren't like really famous artists, and I think that that's unfortunately the kind of work that's going to be affected most.
So we're low on time, and I assume we want to make time for questions. So, we have 1 minute. Do we have a question?
We have time for another question.
All right, we have a couple questions.
I'll try to speak as loud as I can.
The yelling was working for whatever it's worth.
So my question is regarding what y'all said earlier with the rise of AI. Do you think that has something to do with the fact that public education is going down and we're not even investing in the arts? And 20 years from now, we now have this circular thing where AI is creating the art, but we don't have the people and the proficiency to understand it, thus kind of resulting in this classism where the poor don't quite understand it because they didn't have the resources, but now the true art is for the elites. Especially since that's going on in Texas.
I mean, I definitely feel like there's a human desire to create and express oneself, and I feel like that desire does transcend like any any like specific categorization of people. And yeah, I'm confused a bit about the causality of what you're proposing, and I may have misunderstood it partially. I'm happy to toss it to somebody else.
Great question. I don't know. I'm an educator myself, but I teach at NYU, so definitely not in like the public education system. You know, when you teach students that are graduate students in a city like New York, they tend to have access to art, the best museums in the world, and so there is that exposure and that accessibility. I know that's not the situation in the rest of the United States, so I can't really speak for how public education is done at that level, but it's definitely, I'm from Canada where there's a lot of investments in the arts at both the artist and the education level, and I wish that for America as well. I think that's a great thing, and it had a great impact on myself, so I hope that kids, next generations of Americans will also have that.
Hey guys, lovely panel. Richard here. Just a question about how do you bridge human centricity between AI and arts, right, with respect to ideations? I know generative AI is helping in ideation. A lot of companies use generative AI for ideas, but for execution, right, bringing to reality something intangible to the tangible, right? How are you seeing human centricity as a bridge moving towards ethical, responsible, at the same time, a meaningful transition towards, achieving that satiation and creativity?
What I would say, I teach thesis, so my students are producing projects, and some of them will use AI for the ideation process. Now, they could have used the pen, they could have used Photoshop, they could have used Figma. It's not really the thing that they're using that matters to me the most, it's their thought process. When someone shows me a storyboard for a short film they want to make, I'm not super concerned whether or not what tool they're using. I'm concerned whether or not the idea behind the thesis is sound, whether it is critical of our current society, whether they put a lot of thought into it. And so the fear, when people are dealing very much in the realm of ideas, I have less fear that the human will be decentered, because the cause or the nexus of innovation or of thought is the human. It's that student, it's that individual, kind of like what Anna was saying. I think maybe in corporations that may be more of a risk, where you kind of lose the who is actually driving the idea, and it's like these nebulous KPIs, and you're trying to kind of meet them. But I think when you have a human driving the creation process, whatever tool they use, they tend to be hopefully in control of the tool as they come up with new ideas and they refine their ideation.
Yeah, and it's about having engagement with so many steps in the process where it's clear that your agency is kind of actually bleeding out into the final product, and it's very different than just putting in some numbers into a scientific calculator and all the operations happening invisibly, and you get the answer and you can't really tell your arithmetic ability starts to evaporate, and it's important to even if you're using a generative process, to be there the whole time, and that's how you'll generate yourself.
Yeah, no matter what tools you're using, it's always a collaborative process between the artist and whatever it is they're working with, and that inevitably shapes the outcome of the product, or the project, rather.
Good.
Yeah, awesome. That seems like a great place to end. Thank you guys so much for this panel, and thank you for the great questions.